Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you all? Good. So first off, I'd like to preface this with, kind of what the first presenter also talked about is nothing at Bakersfield College is perfect for sure, right? We've all had our bumps in the roads, and certainly there was a lot of mistakes that we learned from, and I think it's still a learning process as well. And also, I'll say this. Each individual campus, I think, has to navigate their particular institutional culture. So one thing that worked for one campus won't necessarily work for another campus. But I'll give you the foundation of what we're doing and then kind of the structure of what we're doing at BC as well. And we'll go from there. So the term completion coaching community really hits home for me because I was an athlete all throughout middle school, high school, and even college. And for those of you who have played athletics and have had a coach, or maybe you have children or family members who play a sport and have a coach, you know that a coach is much more than an instructor for that particular sport, right? A coach goes beyond whether it's basketball, football, whatever the case may be. They go far beyond just that. And they coach you in much more than sports. They coach you in life. So I think the term really hits home as to what the completion coaching communities are really meant to do. It's meant to go above and beyond what a particular job title might imply, right? Next slide. So the first thing I'll do is I'll give you the foundation of the completion coaching communities. And the first foundation is equity, right? And I know typically when we hear equity, I think the first thing that pops into our mind is usually race and gender, right? Usually those inputs and what results in those outputs. But I think not often enough do we think about the environments, right? What are the environments that the students are in? So in terms of these completion coaching communities, I think one of the most important things that we do is we look at the environment, we analyze it, and we try to create it and create the best environment for our particular cohort of students. The next thing I'll talk about is high expectations, right? A lot of times what we expect of students can affect how they expect of themselves and what they expect of themselves. So having high expectations of our students is a very important aspect of what we do, but not just high expectations of our students, also high expectations of our employees as well, right? Because this completion coaching community concept was something that was very much so a concept derived from the ground up. It derived from classified employees, right, and the work that they did, and the administrators taking notice and bringing it to scale. And lastly, and I think probably the most important aspect, is the relationships, right? Building that relationship with students is the primary focus of a completion coaching community. And having a structure where we have the opportunity to build a relationship with students. Because as all the research states, when you have a relationship with students, that can weigh heavy on that student's success. But not just relationships with students either. It's also the relationships we have with each other, the relationships we have with other departments, the relationships between student services and faculty. Those things are also key. So in terms of the way we envisioned our completion coaching teams and the way we implemented it, we had two different types of teams. We had meta majors and affinity groups. Now, meta majors has been talked about a lot, so you guys have a pretty good understanding of that. Affinity groups is a particular group or cohort of students who has a specific unique need. So AB 540, veterans, and also African Americans. It was a particular group of students that either had a unique need or was identified in our equity plan as essentially a bottleneck performer, right? Next slide. So some of the differences. and some of the key reasons we chose to have these two particular structures. Well, in terms of an affinity group, it yielded a more concrete structure for building relationships. Because what's with a meta major, or the thing about a meta major, is that a student can always change their major, right? I had an example of a student 4 months ago who came into my office for the first time and said, they didn't know what their major was going to be. And I said, well, come back next week, think about it, do some research, and let me know what your major is going to be. So he left, he came back next week, he said, I know what my major is going to be. I said, all right, give it to me. What's it going to be? He said, I want to major in math, psychology, and STEM. Okay, and who am I to kill your dreams, right? I've got a bachelor's in criminal justice, a master's in business, and I'm going for my doctorate in education. So I understand wanting to multitask and do different things. But the thing is, what meta major does that fit into? And also the thing is, about 70% of our students change their major, and it's not necessarily going to fit into a particular cluster, right? So if the point of these completion teams is to build relationships, we want to make sure that we have a concrete foundation that's going to stay with them during the duration of their college career. Also, targeted outreach and counseling and student service offerings. Again, addressing those unique needs can be utilized to expand current equity programs, right? Forming these completion teams is not always the easiest thing to do because you got to navigate many different systems in our complex colleges. But a lot of times with some equity programs that we have in place, you've already got components of the completion team already in place. So for example, our college had an Emoja program. So setting up that African American completion team wasn't that too far off because we already had components in place with the Emoja program in itself, right? So a lot of times you already have components in place, and so that's why the affinity groups are where we started in terms of our structure. We were able to hit the ground running with those completion teams, and then the meta majors came next. Now, with the meta majors, I think it's also important to have those as well, because that ensures that every single student has a completion team. Because if you've got a major, then you've got a team, or if you've got a focus. It allows for more robust participation from the faculty. It allows you to get the curriculum involved into the discussion. Better alignment with transfer opportunities, and then also it allows you to connect to careers more easily within that team as well. So in terms of the players within a completion team, we've got our counselors / ed advisors, and I really see those as really the quarterbacks of the team, right? I use a lot of sports analogies, so forgive me. But I really see them as the quarterbacks. I really see them as the one who sort of leads all the action because they're the ones who have the most direct contact with the student. Aside from faculty in the classroom, of course, but they're the ones who have the most consistent contact with the same students, right? So they can deliver the message the best. You have your deans or directors who are essentially the ones who hold the team accountable. So if the dean or the director gets information in it that says 50% of our students have education plans, then they hold the team accountable to make sure we have 55% of our students who have educational plans the next week or the next 2 weeks, to make sure that we're progressing and hold the entire team accountable. We also have our data coach, which I think is probably the most important role on here, because you don't know what you're focusing on if you don't have the data that tells you where your weak points are, or that tells you what students actually need. And the data coach can be any one of these players on here, but it's someone who has access to the research. And it's not an institutional researcher, right? I want to make that distinction because we only have about 4 or 5 institutional researchers at our college, and I know many colleges even have less than that. So a data coach allows the institutional research office to expand its capacity, right? And trains someone on the team to be able to access that data and use it for the team. Of course, disciplined faculty, you can't do it without disciplined faculty. And I think their role is really now being able to alert the team if there's an issue within the studies of the classroom, right? So for example, I had a colleague of mine who is an instructor who teaches a communications course. And she started the course with 20 students, and about 2 weeks later, during their first big assignment, 10 students were missing. So half the class wasn't even there. Well, what do we do for those students? I can tell you, I teach as well. I've been teaching for the last 3 years, and as a faculty member, you don't really have much of a choice in terms of reaching out to those students. I mean, I'll help the students if they come to class, but if they're not in class, well, what do you do? So having that completion team now gives that faculty member an option to send the names of those students to that advisor or counselor, and they can outreach and they can find out, hey, why weren't you in class, right? And they can get to the root cause of what's going on. And of course, your financial aid and your student support expert. Can't do it without them. And they kind of, connect the dots as well. So some key considerations. The first one is creating a one-stop shop, right? When I walked in here, I spoke with one of your students you have in here today, and she was telling me one of the most difficult things about going to college is they send you around to different offices, and everyone, people have got different things that you need. It's like a ping pong ball sometimes, right? And I've seen it. I know that's how it is, not just here, but at all of our colleges, right? So the concept of creating a one-stop shop is to where a student can see and build a relationship with one particular person, and they don't have to bounce around. So for example, when a student came to my office, I would ensure they had everything they need before they left my office. So I had a liaison over at financial aid. You don't have financial aid? Let me call over. Let me see what's going on. Okay, now I know you need X, Y, and Z paperwork. Go ahead and fill this out, and now you just need to drop it off because you know everything before you even get there. So you don't have to wait in line. Also, if you have a hold on your records, right? You don't have to wait in line. I can call over, I can find out what the hold's about. We can get it lifted over the phone right here in my office, right? The other thing is having a specialization, right? And I think this one is also important. One of the ones that pops into my mind in terms of a specialization is the advisor that we had working with AB 540 students, right? What he was able to notice was that a lot of the AB 540 students were paying out-of-state tuition based on how they filled out the application, but they weren't supposed to, right? First off, I don't think anybody at our college even knew how to find who the AB 540 students were, let alone diagnose that particular issue that was going on. But he had a specialization in it. So he was able to not only find who the AB 540 students are by looking at the data, but also diagnose an issue in which these students were paying almost $15,000 in tuition at a community college, right? And he was able to streamline the process of those students paying out-of-state tuition to paying the correct tuition that they're supposed to pay, right? So having a specialization in something, I think, is important. And when you focus on just general counseling or anything general, it's very difficult to be good at one particular thing. So for example, if you're advising students on many different majors, it's hard to know all of the opportunities within a specific major because you're focusing on so many. But if you have a specialization, you can really get good and defined at that particular focus. And then lastly, accountability, right? This structure, I think, does a good job of creating accountability, right? Because so often, if our students are unsuccessful or they're dropping out and the numbers are abysmal, well, who's to blame, right? All of us, I guess? Who knows? We all see random students most of the time in student services. Well, with this completion team model, since we all have a cohort, well, these are our students, right? If the students are on my team, these are my students. If my students are failing, that's my fault, right? Also, if they're succeeding, I get to brag, right? So that's the good side of it. And then also the flip side of that is now the students feel accountable to you as well, right? I had a teacher in high school, and I was a terrible high school student, didn't like homework at all. But I had one teacher who every time I would come and I didn't have my homework, and I hated it because he always called me out. He would say, well, where is your homework? Why didn't we do it? And I knew it was about a 5-minute conversation. Well, I'll tell you what I did. I started doing the homework for that class because I wanted to avoid that conversation. So this model really creates accountability Because now when I see a student, and so often with the drop-in method that most colleges have now, you see a student, you advise them, and you never see them again. Or you might, who knows? Who knows, right? But with this model, you see a student, and then you're able to see them in the middle of the semester, at the end of the semester, and you're able to hold them accountable. So if I'm sitting with a student and I see 5 W's 2 semesters in a row, oh, that's going to be a conversation, right? Because I've invested time in you, and I want some return on my investment, right? So really, it gives that accountability to the whole team. So this is a question I get a lot, so I put it up there, is, well, if you've got meta majors and you've got affinity groups, and you could have a student in 3 affinity groups and a meta major, that's 4 teams for 1 student, right? Aren't we duplicating services? The answer I usually give is yes, but I know administrators hate that answer because then it's a waste of resources in their mind. So I'll phrase it differently. This structure is meant to create nets for our students, right? And with the data that I saw earlier today, I think we need some more nets, right? Because there's a lot of students falling through the holes in our net. So if you have one net that doesn't catch the student, you've got another team or another net that has an opportunity to catch that student as well. So you might have 4 nets. And even though we're doing a lot of the same things, we're just more nets for the students, and hopefully one of those nets catches our student, right? Next slide. And so one of the most important concepts I think of this whole thing is the data, right? I think it's if you don't take anything away, please get a hold of your data and get comfortable with it and start learning it like the back of your hand. Next slide. So some of the data pieces that we were able to implement was communications management. So getting a hold of the emails, the phone numbers, the contact information, and reaching out to students. Too often, I think we just rely on emails. A lot of students don't check emails. Maybe it's just Bakersfield College, but I can tell you a lot of my students don't check emails. I have to text, right? Had to do it. Otherwise, I wouldn't get results, right? So we really have to think about the communications management that we're offering. Data analytics is another good one. Program pathways mappers we talked about a little bit. Student services utilization, so I was able to see how often they went to tutoring, when they went to tutoring, the writing center. So if I see you're doing bad in the class and I ask you to go to the writing center because it makes sense, I can see whether you went or not. And if you didn't go, that's a conversation. And if you did go, then I can give you kudos for that. Early alerts from faculty, just letting us know if there's an issue in the classroom. Focus groups, we can't forget about the qualitative piece because that lets us know what questions to ask and where to focus. Student success data and student data reports on demand. I'll just stop at the last one real quick because I think it's important. Having information on a daily basis, right? So the thing that sort of tripped me out a little bit when I first got to community colleges is this whole 6-year completion data, right? Where we're looking at student success rates over the course of 6 years, right? Even 2 years, right? I don't want to wait 2 years to know if what I'm doing is effective, right? I want to know if what I did this semester worked at the end of this semester so I can change it next semester or I can keep doing it next semester, right? And I think even more urgent than that is having data on a daily basis to see where my students are at every single day. Have I progressed from yesterday to today, right? Next slide. So I like data coaching simply because it helps us build our capacity to look at data. It helps empower the front lines. So myself as an educational advisor, the difference between me and someone in institutional research, I know where to look, right? I know where my students are struggling the most. I know that programs like EOP&S are important to take note of and see how many of my students are in EOP&S because I know EOP&S usually delivers results in terms of making students successful, right? I know our Summer Bridge program is really good, right? So I know if I can get a student in EOP&S in Summer Bridge, well, that student's gonna have a better chance at success, right? But that's something usually only the front lines would know because you work with students on a daily basis. And then also it engages multiple constituencies. And by that I mean, when you can pull the data yourself and you can see it, it makes it more real for you, right? As opposed to getting a presentation from someone in any particular area. You can own it when it's yours that you pull individually, right? And uncovering institutional blind spots, right? So one thing that I was able to notice with my cohort of students, which was African American students, is I was able to notice that a low percentage of African American students were enrolled in EOP&S, and a low percentage were enrolled in our Summer Bridge program, which, like I said, is a very successful program. So I was able to be intentional about having the contact information of all my students and letting them know about these programs, and we were able to double and triple the amount of students that were in the programs, right? So sometimes you don't have to go as far as creating some program, just get the students you have in the programs that you already have, right? And for me, that was definitely the case. And so this is an example of what I was able to do. So for EOP&S, I was able to have the students who were in EOP&S and the students who are not. And for the students who are not, again, building relationships with other departments, I sent that list to EOP&S and I said, tell me which one of these students qualifies for EOP&S, who isn't in EOP&S. And then once they sent the list back of the students that qualify, it was an easy conversation. It was just a phone call, hey, do you want a $200 book voucher? I thought so. Meet me in my office tomorrow, right? And so that number went up very quickly. Next slide. And I think this is probably the last one actually, let's go to the next one, next few ones. One more. Perfect. And then one more after that. Okay, perfect. So this is the last point I want to touch on, is the intrusive guidance, right? So getting to the core of what's really going on with our students, right? And this circles right back around to the relationships that we build. If we don't build those strong relationships with students, we can't do our job as well, right? And if we build better relationships with students, we can do our job better, right? And our job is to make sure students graduate. There's no doubt about it, right? So in order to be intrusive, one thing that I noticed I had to do was collaborate with faculty, right? And build that relationships with faculty so that they felt comfortable coming to me when they had an issue, right? When there were some, whether it be absences, whether it be classroom disturbances, whatever the case may be. I'll give you an example. I had a student, it's probably about 6 months ago, and he would just go to class and he'd be disruptive. He'd walk around, he was talking on the phone, socializing, and the instructor kicked him out, right? And had him go to, and when you get kicked out of class, it's a very arduous process. You have to go to student life, you have to talk to public safety, then you have to talk back to the instructor again. And so he came to me and he wasn't sure what to do. So I was able to contact student life, contact public safety, contact the instructor, set up a meeting, and in talking with that student, having that relationship, I could be very frank, right? And that frank conversation was basically, when you're in class, you need to just shut up and sit still, right? So the teacher won't kick you out, and then we'll do fine the rest of the semester. Long story short, he was able to get back into class and finish the class with a B, right? But these are conversations. This is the learning that takes place for students in interacting with student services and faculty. But learning isn't as effective for those students if we don't have that relationship, right? Next slide. And I'll leave you with this concept. Being proactive versus reactive, right? A lot of our systems are set up in a very reactive way. If a student has an issue, go to counseling. Something happened with financial aid, go to financial aid. Well, the thing is, if we have the data, we don't have to sit around and wait for them to come in. I already know the problems. When I met with students and had an appointment, I already knew what they qualified for. I already knew what they didn't have. I already knew the steps in matriculation that I had to do with those students, because I was the one who called them, and that was why I called them and reached out to them, because I already had the data and I knew what was going on. So I think shifting our focus from being reactive to now being proactive, from drop-ins to now just having appointments, right? And that's a key concept I hope you guys can definitely take away. And lastly, the students who need our services the most come and see us the least, right? One thing I was able to do in working with African American students when I first started, I noticed that in terms of racial demographics, African American students were the least likely to have an education plan, right? Out of all the students that we had in terms of demographics. By the end of the first semester, they were the most likely to have an educational plan, right? And what that told me is that the students that I was bringing in were students that wouldn't have came in otherwise, right? They weren't the African American students who were already coming in, because then the percentages would have stayed the same. But having the percentages be the worst to the best, that lets me know I'm pulling in students that would have never came and seen me had I not been proactive and reached out to them. I think that's where I'll stop. Thank you. Questions? Yes?
So how big is, thank you so much for this presentation.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate the identity-based groups, you know, and the meta-major-based groups, but how big is a cohort, a coaching team? How many students in a coaching team?
Well, for African American students, when I first started, we had about 750 African American students. And then it grew every year. The next year, I think it was around 850. And then by the time this year, it was 1,000. So that was, I think, a good reaction. I don't know if it was because of completion teams or not, but I think it's pretty cool. So the completion cohort that we had in terms of African American students was about 1,000. But for some of the meta majors, it's much more. It could be 2,500, I think, was one of the larger ones. You could be in 3 different ones. Absolutely. Yes?
So, like, in the group that you're talking about, African American, how many counselors are in that group? How do you figure out, like,
How do you manage that many students?
teams? And so there's, looks like there are about 6 or 8 people on each team. So how do you manage the logistics of that?
Like, how do you use 8 people to see 1,000 students, basically?
Yeah, or like, how do you work together? How often do you meet? Like, that kind of structural. How do you build a collaboration between the team members?
Well, ideally, the goal would be to meet at least once or twice a month, at minimum. And in terms of who do you focus on, because I think that's an important thing to talk about as well. How do you meet with 1,000 students? Well, you can't. That's impossible. So what we did, and interesting data point that I was able to notice, is that the African American students who had 30 units or more, there was no equity gap with them. They were as successful and sometimes more successful than as all the other students. But it was those African American students who had less than 30 units who were really the bottleneck performers, right? And so knowing that, that takes you from 1,000 students down to about 250 students, because those are the ones that you know are the most at risk. So my goal every day coming to work was to focus on reaching out to those 250 students, because I know they're new. So I know they don't know the ropes yet. And so that's who I focused on. I could still see all the other students, of course, but those are the ones I'm being proactive about, because I know they need the most help. Hope that answers the question. Any other question? Yeah.
Could we go back to the graphic of the completion team, the one with the giant circle?
Yeah.
So I'm a teacher here. Do I fall under the category of disciplined faculty? And what is the discipline part makes me a little uncomfortable. I was wondering what that was about.
Not a counselor. That's what I mean, because a counselor is more of a counselor instead of a specific, like, content expertise.
Discipline like subject matter. All right.
Not like discipline or anything. The disciplined students. But yeah.
Oh, I feel a lot better about that.
Change in slide.
I know.
On the slide, there's this word, intrusive. Okay, I think, and I don't say that language needs to change.
Right.
I certainly believe you say what you mean, and you mean what you say. When I see that word, there's a part of me that's used to a certain amount of social conditioning, and I go back in psychological terms and say, oh, that word intrusive, is that intervention? Is that intervention? When you say intrusive, how intrusive is intrusive? And you have students who are coming, to other students, tracking them down, saying, look, you need to be doing this as a student. Or are you saying, hey, we just want to let you know, we're
Right.
advising you just from a student point of view, maybe you can get help in this direction, let me go forward. How intrusive is intrusive? Is it true intrusion?
Right.
Or is it intervention?
That is a very good question. I'll say it like this, is that in terms of being intrusive, well, first of all, you can't be intrusive unless you build a relationship first. If you don't have a relationship with the student, throw the intrusive out the window. I don't want you talking crazy to a student because it might not work out well with some students. But if you have that relationship, now that opens the door to be intrusive. If I know you and you know me and now we're cool and now we're buddy-buddy, okay, now I can be real with you. Now I can be more intrusive. And when I say intrusive, it could be as simple as acknowledging failure and acknowledging success. And I'll tell you what I mean. I think a lot of times us as educational advisors or counselors will see a student who maybe has failed a class multiple times or gotten a W, and I think sometimes we're almost robotic in, okay, well, here you're going to try again, and here's your classes, and all right, good luck this time, right? But it avoids having that confrontation about, well, what the heck happened this semester? What's up? Like, you know, did you not go to class? Or are you going to go to class this semester? Like, getting to the real root of the problem. Like, what's going on with you, man? Like, let's stop. Let's take a time out. And let's talk about what happened so we make sure that doesn't happen again. And I think even as instructors as well, and I'm guilty of it, where if a student didn't show up or is showing up once a week, I'm guilty of sometimes falling into a mode of just not saying anything. Just being like, well, you're going to get a bad grade, but, you know, whatever. Or if a student, another example, and sorry, I'm getting kind of talkative here, but a student in one of the first classes I taught came to class with headphones almost every single day. And I remember I said nothing. I'm not doing that student any justice by just being quiet. I know it's affecting his grade. So being intrusive is you say something. Hey, man, why do you got your headphones in? Let's get into gear. You're going to need to pay attention for this lecture. So that's what I mean by being intrusive.
Interventions have the same meaning.
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. Definitely.
Thank you.
Yes. Any other questions? Cool. Thank you all.